Welcome everybody to the SRA webinar series. As with all of our past webinars, this webinar will be available on the SRA.org webpage for members. They are recorded as videos that include the presentations and the audio from the presenters, and they're all archived up there on our webpage. Also, SRA's deadline for abstracts and workshops is May 29th, so you still have time to submit your abstracts or workshop proposals for this year's annual meeting. And you can get that through the SRA.org website also. For today's webinar, you'll be able to submit your questions into the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. Just type them in, and we're going to take all of the questions at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Risk Management and Policy, and we have two presenters today, Frederick Bouder and Terje Aven. Frederick is a professor in risk management and policy at the University of Stavanger. He has for many years developed and maintained international policy networks in both government and academia. He has worked closely with European and national regulators and policymakers. Frederick is a member of the SRA Council and is the incoming president of SRA Europe. He was the founder of the SRA Benelux and was its first president. Terje is the current president of SRA and has been introduced in several of our past webinars, so I'm going to let you refer back to those for his long list of accomplishments. And now I'm going to turn this over to Frederick to say a few words, and then Terje will begin the presentations, and then we'll flip back over to Frederick, and then we'll have questions at the end. So Frederick, over to you.
Yes, thank you so much, Brett. Well, first I just wanted to welcome everyone. I understand we have quite a number of people listening, and I'm really very happy about it and very flattered that people have such a high interest. The way we will run this session, so this is the Stavanger University of Stavanger session, is that first, as Brett said just a minute ago, Terje will present, and then I will present. The idea is that Terje is bringing some of the fundamental issues around governance and policy, and this is something that I think is often missing actually when we speak in policy circle about risk. Sometimes we talk a lot about practices, but we don't talk enough about how does it relate to risk analysis as a field of studies or science. And then I will try to make the link with more practical implications in my talk. So now I'm turning back to you, Terje, for your talk.
Okay, thank you, Frederick. I'm ready. And I will, as you said, give some review and discussions of some fundamental issues of risk management and governance. And I start with questioning sort of what is handling risk, let's say the instruments we have for handling risk. And I would say there are basically three main categories: risk assessments, informed, this kind of robustness, resilience, cautious policy strategies, and third, dialogue. And the two last one, I would say, are really a result of the fact that risk assessment is not really a perfect tool. It has some limitations. And of course, there are always some need for balancing other concerns like cost. Okay. Also, I would like to sort of stress this sort of well-known fact that assessments inform decision-making. The evidence, the knowledge are informing decision-maker. It doesn't prescribe what we should do because there are uncertainties and there are different values. And think about a case when you have actually reduced uncertainties. There are basically nothing, no uncertainties, like, for example, when dealing with sort of the implications of smoking. And I think we can say that we know pretty much what will happen in that particular case, but we still can't say that the assessment would prescribe what we should do because we give different weight to how important is it to be in a room without smoke, and how we would give value to personal freedom, for example. So in general, assessments informing and it's because we have uncertainties and we have different values. So risk management is really about this kind of balance between development and protection. I think this is really important to stress. It's about reducing risk certainties, but also to take risk in order to create values. And different instruments, different tools are supporting development and protection, respectively. For example, cost-benefit analysis is actually supporting creating values and development stage, because it doesn't really give much weight to risk and uncertainties. On the other hand, you have this kind of cautionary, precautionary principles and thinking that is giving sort of favoring protection, and also risk acceptance criteria and the LR principle. I come back to that. So if you go to, for example, risk acceptance criteria, which is typically, at least often seen in the way as shown here, you have a probability number is giving some sort of target or threshold value. So if the risk assessment is producing a number above that probability, risk is not accepted, and if it's below, it's accepted. And surely I would say one have to be very careful in applying that kind of approach, because risk is not only given by a number, it's something more. For example, it doesn't at all reflect on the sort of the knowledge strength supporting that probability number that is from the risk assessment. So you can't compare only through probabilities to see if the risk is acceptable or not. And also there may be other concerns sort of beyond risk to decide if you have acceptance or not. So be careful in applying that kind of mechanistic way of deciding whether risk is accepted or should it be accepted or not. The LR principle is also a principle in sort of favor of protection, at least in theory, and it's sort of is quite a strong principle in favor of safety, saying that if you have a risk-reducing measures, that should be implemented. Unless, as a rule, should be implemented, unless you are able to demonstrate that the costs are grossly disproportionate to the gains obtained. So the burden of proof is reversed. And this is sometimes difficult to implement in practice. It's sort of in regulation, in industry, a lot used a lot, but still difficult to implement, because you need to have a system for producing this kind of risk-reducing measures. And the industry may not have that kind of incentives for doing that, because then they have to implement the measures. The burden of proof is reversed. So also there's a problem with this LR principle that is often being verified by referring to cost-benefit analysis, which is really in contradiction to the basic idea, because these tools are based on expected values, not really capturing aspects of risk and uncertainties, which was really the driver for having the principle defined at all. So that is problematic, I would say. This is one other way of implementing the LR principle, with sort of which is sort of more in favor of the protection side. You have a crude analysis and you see the costs are low. Okay, implement the measure. You do cost-benefit type of analysis. You look at implied cost of averting a fatality. These numbers are fine. Implement the measure. But even if that is not sort of positive, you will look into the uncertainties, how the measure are sort of giving contributions to robustness, resilience, and so forth. And if that is positive, you also have a reason for implementing the measure. So that gives a stronger sort of a way of highlighting the protection side. So some few words about risk governance. How do we define that? I mean, according to the SRA glossary, it's simply saying that the application of governance principles to risk analysis. And governance principles, well, that is sort of features like this: openness, accountability, fairness, reflection, and so forth. And what we saw when this sort of risk governance school was sort of developed some 15, 20 years ago, Now, we saw that a lot of sort of risk issues had features like complexities, large uncertainties, many stakeholders, and even sort of global problems crossing national borders. And the problem were treated like sort of in the simple way, like we have seen for more sort of industrial problem with very probabilistic, narrow probabilistic approaches. And certainly that was not sufficient. So something had to sort of be developed to meet that kind of new challenge. So we're facing uncertainties, lots of uncertainties, different value differences, and we cannot then simply treat them as simple problem where we have probabilities, and these are basically objective, and proceed from that. We need to do something else, and that led to sort of the risk governance type of thinking and frameworks that also Fredrik will come back to. So within that kind of frameworks, we need these kind of strategies for handling risk. I mean, risk assessment is still relevant in these cases, not by quantification necessarily, but to address risk and being informed by risk. And then, of course, also robustness, resilience, cautious-based policies, and dialogue. And that is, of course, extremely important, all of these. And in practice, you find kind of a balance between all these three strategies being applied. So there is even some sort of people and organizations today that make sort of a call for a shift from risk to resilience. And I remember that the General Secretary, or UN General Secretary, some years ago was stating this had this kind of statement, making a call for going from risk to resilience. I'm not sure really how to interpret that, because I'm not thinking that they will say that it's out with risk and now it's only resilience, but I think it's saying that we should highlight resilience more than we have been doing. And I agree, in some sense that this makes sense. And modern risk management, modern risk analysis actually see resilience as a cornerstone, as a one major strategy for dealing with risk. So there's no conflict here. That's not a problem. I say that these are together. We need to have them both, risk and resilience. They are friends, I say. And because if you think about a system, it could be obviously improved by thinking about the resilience of the system. I mean, it could be strengthening the immune system, it could be diversification and other means strengthening the system. But we also need to think about risk. This figure here show that sort of a lot of threats, and science and research is actually trying to identify these. What are these problems? What are these threats? Understand how they affect the system. So that's what we do in research, and then we're into the risk domain. Think about the health of a person. We can improve the resilience, yes, but we will also look into more. Think about medicine, to study what can happen and investigate that and see if that is a problem or not. So I think this is exactly showing this sort of mixture of policies. We need both resilience-based thinking, but also risk-based thinking. In addition, we have the point that there's a lot of threats and we have limited resources. Therefore, we need to optimize and use our resources in a smart way. And that also leads us into some sort of risk thinking, not by numbers necessarily, but by reflecting on risk. So this is actually saying what I just mentioned, that we can improve resilience in different ways. So I don't say more about that. And also this slide is just saying, I think, what I've been already saying. Yeah. We need to also look into risk. We cannot just focus on resilience. We need both. So finally, a few words about the cautionary and the precautionary principle, which are basic principles of risk management and risk governance. And the example we can think about is, for example, that you have a new chemical, you haven't been able to test it, and there are potential serious effects of that, and there are scientific uncertainties what will happen, and then the result can be that you don't accept this chemical, you will not allow it to be used, so you are applying the precautionary principle. Another example is this one, quite interesting, linked to the decision made by Germany some few years ago that they will close the nuclear energy, and the German Ethics Commission that sort of paved the way for this decision. Half of that commission stated that nuclear energy is not acceptable because of its catastrophic potential. So really they applied a cautionary thinking for that kind of decision, or that recommendation for that decision. And finally, I will have another example of cautious thinking. This is, you see this bolt, this is maybe some 2-3 hours from where I live. You do some hiking and come to this place, and you can jump on this bolt, and a lot of people do that. Tourists come there every year. Unbelievable, because it's 1,000 meters down. So you should be really brave to do that, but most people do it. Unbelievable. I was also there some years ago, but I was chicken and I didn't jump on that bolt. I applied the cautionary principle, you can say. It was not so important for me. I felt to go on that stone to feel good, but many other people do that, and they jump on that bolt and feel brave and good, and they still may apply the cautionary thinking and principle, because when they jump or they walk towards that bolt, they are extremely cautious, because they know any mistake now, and it's 1,000 meters down, no hope for sure. So you have to be really cautious in that case, and unbelievable, nobody has fallen down yet. That's really unbelievable, I would say. But it's great also, showing that people are really cautious in that process, in that jump from when they are doing this. And I think it's quite brave. And it showed this kind of, which I would like to highlight, this kind of balance, as I was mentioning, this balance between protection and development. And this is what it's all about, I think, in personal life, in organization, all over, that we have to find that kind of balance. If we don't take risk, we obtain nothing. So if you are always chicken, you obtain nothing. On the other hand, if you are too much risk taking, it's also a problem. So you have to find that balance, and there is no formula for doing that. It's about politics, management, personal prioritizations, and that is the challenge, where risk analysis can help in producing input, but not the decision. I think that was all, Frederick, so I will give the words to you. These are just some references that you can consult for aspects linked to that, this discussion here. Thank you.
Excellent. And so
thank you very much.
I'm going to switch over the presenter to Frederick, and you should be getting prompted now, Frederick, to become the presenter.
I just accept it.
Okay. We do see your screen. So if you make it
right.
Perfect. Excellent.
Is that good? Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, actually, Terje, and we didn't actually consult on that, ended up showing that people can be cautionary even when they are reckless. But I would like to start my talk with somebody who was sitting next to me on a plane I was going to an event, a conference at the University of Michigan, and I was working actually on my slides, and this guy looks at my slides and says, "Oh, what are you working on? What are you doing?" And I say, "Well, I'm a risk academic, and I'm presenting on risk, and he says, oh, actually, you're one of these people who are trying to keep us safe and always say safety first. Actually, I'm just going to this Burning Man, and I don't know if some of you know about it. It's basically these so-called community experiences where the community explores various forms of artistic self-expression. That's how it's self-defined. But interestingly, these Burning Man gatherings gather thousands and thousands of people, and at the end, they burn this man, and it can be quite dangerous. And he says, well, for us, when we think about these gatherings, we always use the expression of safety third. So you are the safety first man, and I'm the safety third man. So just to show that people can be quite reckless. So when we translate that into policy, obviously policymakers don't like, these reckless people, one would assume. And one reason they may say is, yes, for them, policy is rational. Policy is about such things are saving lives, responding to people's preferences and weighing the pros and cons and saving money. And in that sense, scientific evidence is very attractive for policy and risk policy, more specifically. Well, what I would like to argue as well is that actually sometimes scientific evidence is unattractive for risk policy, because policy is also emotional. It's not just about rational decisions. And sometimes questions are raised like, do we have time for this? Meaning, do we have time to go through a thorough scientific assessment before we take some decision? No, we need some action. We need some action now before it's too late. And also questions are raised, like, can we trust these guys? Meaning, can we trust the scientific evidence? Can we trust a study that was produced by industry, for example? Is it as good as a study that was produced by the good guys? Meaning, for example, an NGO. These questions are floated around when you talk about the real people dealing with policy. And also, okay, saving money is great, but whose money are we talking about? Who benefits? So these are the ambiguities of policy. And what is interesting, in contrast to that, when we go back to the risk field, is that, of course, we've been developing as scientists for a number of years now models in order to approach policy and regulate risks better. So one approach that some of you may be familiar with was developed in the 80s by the NRC in the US, the so-called Red Book, that looked into a proper way to go through what Oswin Rand would call the risk handling chain, from research to risk assessment to risk management. And this is what you would see here presented on the left corner. And it's been used as guidance by regulatory agencies in the US, but has also influenced thinking more generally about how to govern risk. And on the top right corner, you would see there a development that took place on our side of the Atlantic, on the European side, where we are, Terry and I, sitting at the moment, which is about the IRG model of risk, very informed by the work of Oswin Rand and others, and which is really essentially the same as saying, we need to have a proper way to go from pre-assessment to assessment management of the risks. At the bottom of the page, you would see some a model which was devised in the UK, which is called the tolerability of risk model, or you could call it a heuristic if you want, to see how we can engage with defining what is an tolerable, what is an acceptable, what is an unacceptable risk. And this is a bit of another way to look at it, which is more of a way to say, okay, depending on the probabilities, depending on social acceptance, and Terry already introduced the notion that values and acceptance are very critical to risk, we might decide that some risks are worth taking and others are not worth taking. So today's policy environment is characterized by a number of factors that I would like to highlight as well. We live in what Ragnar Lofstedt called, now over 10 years ago, a post-trust society. At least some areas of risk regulation are characterized by a post-trust environment. What we mean by that is that there's a growing levels of public distrust towards industry, regulators, and policymakers. This is especially true in Europe, but I think it happens in other parts of the world as well, where we experience a number of regulatory scandals and failures. In Europe, we had the tainted blood scandal in the 90s, the BSE, mad cow disease, which was a very defining moment, or other scandals. And in this environment, publics are demanding access to information. Increasingly, members of the public don't just sit around and wait for official information, but they want direct access to it. It's also an environment which promotes a criticism of science, and therefore, where new insights, pluralism of science is welcome. But that can be, of course, dangerous as well, because the evidence, the weight of the evidence may be very uneven. And we've seen that with issues such as the relationship between measles, mumps, and rubella vaccination, with alleged link to autism, for example, where there a flawed study that tended to suggest this relationship was promoted as, another scientific study of equal weight compared to a more robust study. Then we have seen as well issues around how the media are using these information, and the pluralism of science environment, of course, provides opportunities to bring to the public various theories, various allegations, and how the media may amplify those risks. And we have seen also the fact that now that we have more information sources, we have also more opportunities to have scientific and unscientific claims accessible, whether we are accessing them through the press, through television, but also now through the internet, through social media, Twitters, and the like. So we have a web of information, and some of it is science-informed, and some of it is absolutely not science-informed, but could look very convincing to many people. That also leads to an environment where the public tends to express concerns for risks that are increasingly small and uncertain. Well, I would say that some of the defining events that took place about 2 years ago or a year and a half ago in the US, such as Brexit in Europe and the election of Donald Trump in the US, also showed that it's not just about truth. We've been hearing a lot about this truth society and fake news, but it's also about trust as well. The kind of processes, and that I already highlighted in the previous slide, we are seeing that under our very eyes. People don't trust the system. So how do we move from there? How do we improve government policy in this environment? How do we reconcile, on the one hand, the need for a due process, the need for risk governance framework, some science-informed ways to deal with risk, and the fact that people don't trust governments as much as they used to, or look at alternative sources of information without necessarily the critical eye that one would expect coming from the science corner. Well, there have been a number of efforts to devise models, and one of them I'd like to point to was a guide I was engaged in producing with the UK government a couple of years back, which I would call a survivor's guide. It was about principle of risk management and communication, and really starting from, okay, when you are in government and you are struggling with policy in this kind of post-trust environment, how do you deal with it? What are the things that matter? So what have we learned? Well, one thing we've learned is that risk-taking is about values. It is not just about whether it's very likely to happen, less likely to happen, and who is going to be hurt. That means that we need to agree on the process to weight those values. And there are some approaches, of course, that have been in place for a while, to weight pros and cons, to weight different options, such as cost-benefit analysis, risk-benefit analysis, and I would like to add as well risk-risk trade-offs, which is sometimes kind of forgotten in the policy world, but very promising, and I'm pointing to the book by Graham and Winner back in '95. And those formalized approaches to weight options have a role to play. But they are not the end of the process. They also need to be agreed upon. And there is no magic bullet. it really depends on the circumstances as well. I'm trying to move to the next slide, but it seems it doesn't move. So maybe Brett, if you have the opportunity to do that.
Try hitting escape on your end, and then and seeing if that works.
Yeah, maybe.
Okay, and then try going back in, and that should, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Good.
So, and in this relationship, risk to health and the environment have a special role in most people's minds, and this is something we need to think about. What is the value? And we need to understand the role given to environment or health in a given context. So there is not one role for all. In different countries, in different environments, we may experience a weight that is quite different. In Sweden, chemical regulation, for example, is a hot topic. In Germany, less so. But in Germany, the nuclear risks are really hyped and really perceived very negatively. So we need to understand this context in order to think more about how the trade-offs can be achieved. In that environment, risk perception science is of great help. And as we know from the risk field, there has been a huge amount of studies developed since the 70s by people like Baruch Fischoff and Paul Slovich about how people perceive risks. But this is also something we need to be very careful and deal with great care. And I'd like to refer also to the work of Baruch Fischoff in '95, or a recent article being published by Terrier and Aldin Wren, showing that, risk perception is sometimes misunderstood, misinterpreted. And I remember, for example, Baruch Fischoff highlighting the problem of during risk comparison. People tend to say, okay, we are more comfortable driving our cars, but it's more risky than other activities, etc. This doesn't always help to deal with real policy issues. What we need also to recognize is that there are different situations in relation to the risks, and this is something that was already touched upon by Terrier. Complexity, uncertainty, and ambiguity of the information may actually help us to deal with the right policy, and they may drive different approaches. For example, risk-informed management may work better when there is a lower level of uncertainty and ambiguity, and when there is a high level of uncertainty, more precautionary approaches could be appropriate, while ambiguous situation may need more deliberative types of management. So we need to pay attention to these various circumstances. Yet preferences and value always play a role here too. And I would like to stress that again and again. So, for example, are regulators really interested in regulating a risk? Or are they just focusing more on the hazard? Such debates have taken place recently in Europe around endocrine disruptors, for example, or products like glyphosate. Some regulators saying, no, we need to ban the substance because we don't like that, which other regulators saying we would like to have a proper look at the risk assessment. And these positions may vary depending on the issues, which means that the same countries may not be on the same page depending on what issue we're talking about. Finally, transparency has become more and more of an issue in the regulatory and policy world. There has been an emphasis on disclosure of conflicts of interest, but also disclosure of information and data. We are in the age of big data. This, however, in my view, is not enough. Disclosing, providing raw information, what people like Carrie Caglianese have called fishbowl transparency, is not enough. We need to also explain why and how we make specific choices for policy. And this is something regulators still have to improve in this day and age. Some take-home lessons, and I'm going towards the end of my presentation. Risk management and governance model offer conceptual clarity. We need them. We need some modernization. We need some underlying concepts. This is very important, as we hope we have convinced you, both Terje and I. Well, step one, we need to know more about risk science. And I'm always interested to see that in policy circles, many people don't have a great knowledge of what risk science can bring to them, how it could help them to make decisions. But step two, we should not get ahead of ourselves. There is no magic bullets. It's not just applying the risk governance framework X or Y. It is also not about devising the perfect checklist that we can't provide to the policymakers. At the end of the day, they will need to make decisions. And this is where we reach the real world of policy. In the real world of policy, we need to account for perceptions, for values, also for trust relations, what I hope I have convinced you. So my final conclusion is that with all that, often we can do better. We can do a better informed decision and policy. We can work towards that. There is no perfect world, but there is a lot to improve. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you both for your presentations. I'll remind people that you may type in your questions into the questions section of your GoToWebinar control panel. I'm also going to remind folks that that we can receive SRA abstracts and workshop proposals through sra.org until the 29th of May. And with that, we have the first question has rolled in. And this one is from Rob Mitkus. It says, the second speaker mentioned that risk management is about science, which is rational and societal values. However, some social values are irrational and therefore should be ignored or modified. He provided the example of endocrine disruption, focusing on hazard as irrational, as opposed to focusing on risk. Please comment. That was a long question. Did you catch that,
Yes.
Frederick? I think it was
yes, I get that. Yes, I think the world of policy, as I try to introduce, is about both. It's about both rationality and non-rationality, and what policymakers have to be able to do. And I realize that's a challenge. And I mean, to clarify, before I went to academia, I was engaged in policy, so I've seen that firsthand. Is to recognize both. So, but to be very explicit about what we decide, which way we are going. And that's why I was providing these examples from Europe on endocrine disruption, on glyphosate, on such issues. Some regulators side more with science and saying, okay, that's the state of science. There are some uncertainties, but we're going to make decisions on the basis of what we know today. But often they are not very explicit, and that's where actually as scientists we can help to clarify. At the end of the day, it's about decision, but it's about being more explicit about what underpins these decisions. So this is really what I meant.
May I add there to that, and I stress again this important distinction between sort of the science, the knowledge, and the evidence that is really informing, and that is, I will say, fundamental. We talk a lot about science-based decision-making nowadays, but I think it's really misleading. So it's really about science informing. But we can, I mean, as experts on risk and uncertainty, we can also provide some guidance on the way of thinking, how to develop the policies, how to develop the ideas for the risk management and the governance. And that is adding something also which is also scientific, but we don't give the answer. We don't say this is the way you should sort of deal with this risk at the final stage.
Excellent. We do have another question from Charlene Wu. It says, Dear Frederick, what published material, including published articles, would you recommend as course reading for graduate level classes?
Wow, that's a vast question, because I like reading, so I would recommend a lot. So, I mean, it really depends, and maybe this is something which I think the discussion with, first of all, attend SRA meetings, and then you'll be, maybe you do that already, and you can see a lot going on. But actually now maybe I'm promoting my own publications, and I don't like doing that. But we did together with Ragnar Lofstad, we did actually a for Routledge an edited volume on the kind of best articles on risk. So obviously there is a lot of other stuff, but that would be one place to start. But again, there's so much, it's really difficult to answer that question.
Okay, excellent. Terry, I don't know if you have any suggested.
I should be careful. I should be careful also about that. It's I think that there are not that many books on risk policy. Maybe you will protest there, Frederick, but there are a lot of books on risk management and even governance and risk analysis, but really addressing issues linked to policy on risk with its practical aspects. I mean, there are papers in volumes, but not so many monographs. Would you agree on that, Frederick?
I totally agree. I think that's a great point.
Okay. We still have quite a few people on the webinar. I would encourage you to submit your questions if you have any while you have these experts on the phone or on the webinar. So type in questions if you have them, and I'll stall for just a minute by again reminding people that all of these webinars are up on the SRA.org webpage. You have to be a member to see them, but joining is easy through that same webpage. Let's give it another minute to see if we have additional questions, and if we do, great. And if we don't, then we'll give people a little bit of time back in their day. Oh, we've got questions popping up. This one's from Kara Grieger. It says, "Thank you for the great webinar. The IRGC published their Emerging Risk Governance Guidelines in 2015. It seems like it is a first draft or maybe a second draft. Do you know if it will be revised again like the regular guidance published in 2017?
Do you know, Frederick?
Well, my understanding is that there is some revisions in the pipeline. That's my understanding, and that the IRGC, of course, I can't speak for them, but they want to continue that work, but probably they want to move on as well. So not just revising the same guidelines forever, but trying to see some applications. At least that's my understanding of the direction. Again, not speaking for them, but just seeing it as an observer.
Excellent. Okay. Do you guys have any additional points you'd like to make, or any thoughts that have come up over the course of the questions in the webinar? And if not, we're getting several questions being submitted, but they're thank yous and compliments on the webinar as opposed to questions at this point. So I think you must have done a very good job of covering the material. And I'll thank both Frederick and Terje for the great presentations. And we'll give everybody a few minutes back in their day. So
and then I would just like to add, if I allowed,
sure,
Brett, I would encourage you to look at our SRA webpage on this sra.org/resources, because we have produced some documents that also are relevant for this. And we are still thinking about how we can further develop these kind of guidelines on what is good risk management and governance and policies. So I think that is something we have to work on in the future. We cannot produce books through SRA, but we can provide some key principles and guidelines. I think that would be useful, I think. Thank you.
And any sort of, that's a very good point. And any sort of comments that people have back on that, it's a nice hub. Those resources are a nice hub.
Yeah. I'd like to stress that as well, because we have some of the great minds in the field of risk who are gathering around SRA, and that's one of the reasons why we can do that, and that's great.
I thought we were ending, but we do have one more question. Peg Coleman, hi Peg, submitted a question, It says, any comments on this reference? 1, Food and Drug Administration, FDA 2011, communicating risks and benefits, an evidence-based user's guide, and then she lists the web page where it's available, and I could pull it up on the screen if you'd like. But are you familiar with the reference of the FDA's 2011 communicating risks and benefits, an evidence-based user's guide?
Yes, I am, and that's a great book. I think, historically, Baruch Fisher was advising the FDA as chair of the Risk Communication Committee, and that's very much to be understood in the light of this work and his great contribution. So that's a book I would really recommend for people who have an interest in risk communication. Obviously, communication and policy are very linked, although the focus of that work is more on communication. So I'd say linked to what we are saying today, but not exactly the same. But I would really definitely recommend that reading. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks for the recap, and Peg, thanks for the suggestion. Okay, with that, thank you everybody for joining, and thank you especially Frederick and Terje for presenting. So
it was a pleasure.
Pleasure.
To everyone.
Yeah. Okay, goodbye.